Divorce is a renovation of a relationship, not necessarily the end. Stay tuned to learn how to build a better post-divorce relationship.
Welcome to Women Winning Divorce, the podcast helping successful women navigate divorce with dignity so you can protect yourself, your children, and your assets. I'm Heather Quick, founding attorney at Florida Women's Law Group, where women win at life.
This week we had Karen McNenny on the show, and we had a great conversation about how your relationship changes but isn't over after divorce. I hope this episode is valuable to anyone who might be listening. Stay tuned for the full episode. Welcome to this week's episode of Women Winning Divorce. I'm Heather Quick, owner and attorney at Florida Women's Law Group. Today, Karen McNenny is joining us. Karen is a certified mediator, therapist, and co-parenting specialist. She focuses on helping families, especially those with children, navigate the complex emotional and logistical challenge of divorce more smoothly. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you, Heather, for having me on the show. Delighted to be here.
Well, I am so excited to have you. And for our listeners, today, Karen and I will be discussing how to shift your mindset to view divorce as a renovation that improves relationships, how to navigate trust issues and co-parenting dynamics for a healthier family environment, and approaching spousal support and co-parenting as ongoing relationships. Very exciting stuff, Karen. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I think that so often when we arrive, which none of us plan our divorce when we're getting married, myself included, but I am 13 years post-divorce, and we've guided our children from kindergarten through college across 2 homes.
Well, that is something to be commended, and I know from that, so many of our listeners will have so much to learn, and I know you help your clients with all of that so much. But for our listeners, I'd love it if you'd share a little bit about yourself and of course, your own divorce story and why you chose to work in the family law and divorce space.
Yes, and it is one of those questions, I'm sure you get it too, Heather, like, why would you want to hang out with people who are going through divorce all the time? I find this work so rewarding. And of course, it comes from my own personal journey. As I mentioned 13 years ago, when the husband and I were facing our disillusion. And I was paralyzed by the thought of divorce because there seemed to be one strong message. If you get divorced, you'll destroy your future relationship with your co-parent. You'll end up with buckets of debt. Your children will be dysfunctional, and you'll be on enemy lines for the rest of your life. And I just could not face any of that, or a long, drawn-out, litigated court case with high attorney fees. I was just paralyzed with fear. And we started to realize that, well, there are other options. You don't have to just stay in the bad marriage or only have the destructive divorce. There is a middle path. And so coming to that work now as a mediator, trained as a therapist, a co-parenting specialist, I really built the business that I was looking for when I faced my own divorce. Where are the resources, beyond, the skill of people like you and your firm, Heather, that are going to help us navigate all the financial components of divorce, the custody journeys, the pieces of the legal story that, we as lay folk are not familiar with. And I am known in my circle of saying lawyers are going to help us get divorced, but who's going to help us know how to be divorced? Because once the ink is dry, there is a whole nother future story that is evolving. That doesn't end at 18. It doesn't end when you walk out of the courtroom. It is a forever relationship. And I remember sitting in yet another couples counseling session with my husband at the time, fighting for that marriage, fighting to save that marriage, coming to the recognition that we were going to be a healthier, more vibrant family living across 2 homes rather than 1 home. And I think the statistics and research will show that children exposed to a high conflict marriage in a home that is filled with yelling and debate and hostility will be more damaging than 2 healthy homes where co-parenting is guided and successful. So I have created the Good Divorce Experience, the Good Divorce Show, my own podcast, to help others see their pathway through the litigated legal journey and hopefully to a forever relationship in protecting their future relationship as those children grow and age.
And that is so commendable and definitely needed because there really isn't that in this space. And I know that often, our clients, after we're done, right, and especially gearing up for, we are required to do mediation in all cases. So, and we, gearing up to do that, there's also a lot of activity, contact with the client, and the majority of our cases settle. And or at trial, so much interaction, and then we're done, right? As the lawyers, we've done our part, we've done what we were hired to do, and there the client is left with, like you said, now what? How do I now become divorced? So I think it's wonderful that you, and obviously you're there before, we're done, but helping them through the process because, all kind of like how do you be married, right? That should be your next one, right? Because people don't know how to do that either, except for that's why they're getting divorced. But because all they know is what they learned at their family of origin. You just kind of, you figuring out as you go. And that is exciting that you're doing, what
It's
you
like
are doing.
there's a cliff. And I remember sitting in that final co-couple counseling session with our therapist and her kind of saying well, I think my work here is done. And that painful recognition that our marriage was complete and asking her, well, can you keep working with us? Can you guide it? We don't know how to talk to our kids. We don't know how to create a transition schedule. We don't know how to get all the hockey gear from one house to another house. How do we inform our families without them getting overly involved, right? Again, it's not just the logistics, it's how will things carry on down the road. And she gave us one more session. She said, well, you can come back for one more session and we'll talk about some of those things. I'm like, I don't want to screw up my kids as soon as we, out of the chute. And she said a few really interesting key things, Heather, that stayed with us. And one of the first ones was, do no more harm. Do no more harm to this forever relationship that you have as you are connected between your children. That means every email, every text message, every roll of the eyes, every story that you tell in your community, how you represent your family. And, for those of us that have maybe, I'm thinking about your listeners who've had big ruptures. There's been betrayal of, financial infidelity, maybe sexual infidelity, addiction behaviors, really big betrayals. And how do we possibly repair and come out the other side of those? And I always say, the only way to go through it is to go through it. And that means there is the pain, the anger, the bartering, the acceptance, all those stages. And getting to a place that we recognize, and I was certainly there in my angry stage post-divorce and chatting with a close friend who happened to be a social worker. And I was just raging on really the disappointment of where we had come to and the conflict that was still living out in the divorce process that, of course, reflected the marriage process. And she said, Karen, when I hear you talk like this, it just seems like you're taking the poison and waiting for him to die. Just stop it. Just stop it. Easier said than done, because when we are emotionally hijacked and ignited, that is what takes over. But what she was really saying is, what is going to be value added going forward? What is going to matter in 5 weeks, 5 months, 5 years, 25 years? And I think our marriage counselor was saying the same thing when she said, do no more harm. Enough harm has been done. So where can you suspend some of that resentment and bitterness so that you don't have to carry it around into the future? And it is a choice.
Yes, it is. And, for many, it can seem overwhelming. and they're not ready to let it go either, right? You have to get to that point where you're ready to move forward, because it only hurts you the more you carry that around. Now, you've described a divorce as a renovation rather than the end of a relationship. Now, I think that's great. I'd love for you to expand on that, and how does that shift your mindset?
Well, I think that we have missed out on one of the great paradigm shifts of divorce, which is that divorce exists to relieve two people from an otherwise painful and destructive relationship. In short, divorce exists to improve that primary relationship, not make it worse. If you want it to get worse, stay in the bad marriage. It will likely get worse.
Way worse, yeah.
And so it's this off ramp. It's this exiting opportunity. And because the national narrative, the social narrative around divorce has so much negative connotation, that because your marriage is ending, that means there's no love that exists between you. You must lawyer up and fight to the bitter end, and that you will in some way be enemies throughout time. That does not have to be the story.
Right.
And I'm speaking right to the heart of your listeners who might be on that threshold, who can come to a firm like yours that's going to help mediate and move through, hopefully with less conflict and less destruction. So if we look at divorce, again, not as an ending, but as a renovation. And that's what I tell I typically work with the couple hand in hand, from decision through decree, and then launching them into this new lifestyle of raising children across two homes, or potentially nesting within one home. And I know you've got some wonderful episodes out there, as do I, on our podcast about nesting, which is a rare thing that couples can do. But this idea that our marriage might be ending, but not the relationship. We're renovating that relationship. And I think one of the places where we often get it wrong, those of us who find ourselves on the threshold of divorce, is honestly, Heather, we just stay too long. We know the truth long before we speak it. We don't see the exit strategy. We want to save until we have done one of the parties a lot of destruction to, in some ways, then justify. See how bad it is? See how terrible we're treating each other, or these terrible things that have happened. We have no choice but to blow this marriage up.
And then when you do wait so long, that anger and resentment and everything, that just grows. It's at such a level that, now you got to try to overcome that on the parenting issue. And I think you're right. So many women wait, if they've been thinking about it for years and years. And sometimes the stuff that goes on, it's very difficult for them to move past that and have a relationship at all.
And there's the fear, will I be able to support myself? What will happen to the kids? What will custody, like all of these unknown questions. And it's almost taboo to explore it. I always say, boy, when we were planning our marriage, there's magazines and we talk to friends and we're designing this life together. Well, I would like to suggest to your listeners that you can also design your divorce. You can take control of that, and even consider, what if we left while there was still love? Not that we're in love, right? Obviously that's eroded, but that there's still some component of connection between these parents that they can, honestly, you're going to need it in the future as you co-parent, so that not everything has just been burned and scorched earth, that we actually recognize there was a love story here. There is a reason we got married. We've created these children from love. And can we take that into the next chapter? And I want to challenge really the divorce industry and the divorce narrative to say, yes, actually, we can design our divorces. We can leave them with dignity, and we can still embrace the truth that there's a love story in there. And that maybe the vow isn't as long as we both shall live, but instead as long as we both shall love.
Oh, very nice. Very nice. I like that. Now, let's talk about that because if you're seeking a divorce to better your life, to better your relationships, why does society look down on women, bettering their lives?
There's so much shame around divorce. We see it as the great failure.
Right.
And because there's shame around it, then once we start moving through it, there's a lot of isolation. I always said, if our family had announced that there had been a death in the family or someone had been diagnosed with cancer, like I would have had a lot of friends showing at my front door with a casserole and a lot of support. But
Right.
when it's
Right.
divorce, we don't know how to respond. We don't know how to support people. And so, in that way, ladies, sometimes you're the one who needs to educate the circle around you. And that if you're sitting in that cave of shame, that there may be someone in your life, several people who come knocking on the door, who bring you out of that, and to recognize that there is not shame in having the wisdom to know this relationship, it's toxic, it's unhealthy, it is setting a poor example for our children. I had that critical moment, and I think a lot of women, we have the mantra that runs over and over: stay for the children, stay for the children, stay for the children.
Right.
I'll wait till they graduate. Once they're 18, then it'll be easier. We have all of these sort of gaslighting mantras that we tell ourselves that keep us stuck. Well, there was a moment where I was in such a rage. I was so frustrated in my marriage, and I started taking it out on my children, right? As we do as adults, we're imperfect. And they
Right.
were 5 and 7. They were little ones. And I remember the moment they were in the bath, splashing around, and I just was at my wit's end. And I was so stressed and felt so stuck because all the choices I had were, this destructive divorce or this eroding marriage. And in that moment of rage towards my kids and who they were seeing as an unhappy, unfulfilled mother and woman,
Right.
I
Right.
realized I shouldn't be staying for the children. I actually need to leave for my children. And a few months after that moment, once we were living in 2 homes, the kids and I were up late. We were, making nachos or ice cream sundaes, and we were having such a delightful time. And my daughter, in her little 7-year-old eyes, looking at me and just smiling and saying, "Oh, Mama, you're just so happy. I just love it when you're happy." And I realized that the courage to leave was the beginning of not just me, but also their father beginning to reinvent who we are into a better version of ourselves, a better version of our co-parenting relationship. And when we can see that wisdom, don't stall out. Lean in to the courage of the decision so that you can renovate into a better, healthier, more vibrant family.
And, so a lot of times, whether it's that you stayed too long, you have a lot of feelings that are difficult to overcome, or, just so much has happened in the marriage that not only do you want, you definitely want a divorce, you don't ever want to see him or talk to him again, which when you have children is virtually impossible.
That's
So
right.
what would you say to that woman listening right now who is like, Karen, oh my gosh, the thought of him is just too much. But of course I love my children. And, what would you say to them? Like, how do they even begin to start framing their mindset to think about this?
Yes. And I'm actually going to invoke one of the great pioneers in this field, Christina McGee. And she says, we need to embrace the truth that we love our children more than we hate our ex.
Yeah.
And I think most of us could lean into that truth. I do love my children more then I dislike their ex. And in my case, I have a good divorce. I'm proud of my divorce. We are friendly. We're not friends.
Right.
And we can show up in the same place, and we always have. And boundaries are really a great part of it. And that's one of the things, some families only communicate through Our Family Wizard or some other online application. And also knowing, listeners, that things will change over time. The elixir of time is kind of a healing process, cannot be replaced by anything else. And what feels hot and spicy and hurtful now, in a year, it will look different. And in 3 years, it will look different again. It really depends on what you choose to hold on to. And the reality is, the past is gone. And when I'm working with couples and they start poking around on those old wounds, like, well, they did this and they shouldn't have, and how about, and once upon a time, I'm like, it's non-changeable. There is nothing we can do about that. The only thing you have control over now is your future and how you choose to lean into it. And I would also suggest that, behavior is contagious. Attitudes are contagious. And if you are the person who can bring one softness, one kindness to the conversation, to the post-divorce relationship, often that will be reflected by your co-parent. And they realize, oh, we're not always going to be adversarial. They said, like, the simplest thing, thank you for taking the lead on getting all the dentist appointments in place. I really appreciate when you step up for our kids like that. Just that then is an invitation to the other parent to say, oh, well, you're welcome. Thank you for noticing. I also really appreciate it when you take the lead on the back to school shopping, because I hate to shop. And we start to recognize that even when we were in one household, right, we all had different roles. Maybe someone was the secretary of the family and someone was the financial and someone was the activity person and someone was the academic person. And sometimes we just sit in disappointment that our spouse couldn't do it all. And then we're in divorce and we're still disappointed. And somehow we think they're going to be a different person. And I say, just to remind you, your ex-spouse is the same person you were married to. So the same challenges are going to show up. Your job is to find the things that do work. And in softening and appreciating, right? I mean, the unknown and sometimes unthinkable, what can we appreciate about our co-parent that ends up kind of softening the edges around that relationship as we redefine and reconstruct who we are to each other? We're not lovers. We're not going to share all the intimate parts of our life. We have the business of raising our children. And if we can really categorize that as a business relationship, which means once a month, we have a co-parenting roundup. We have a news report that goes between houses each week. We make sure that both of us are on every single mailing list with teachers and coaches, and that we don't fall into that passive aggressive tendency. And oh gosh, it can feel so good to see your ex-spouse fail. Well, they forgot the soccer cleats this week. Well, they probably didn't remember that there's an extra rehearsal for dance class. And I say, well, who's going to suffer when there's no soccer cleats at the game? Who's going to suffer when they miss out on that extra rehearsal? It's just your kid, right? So what if you sent the reminder message? Hey, you're probably already tracking that there's an extra rehearsal this week before the Nutcracker, but just wanted you to remind you that it's Saturday at 2:00 in case the paperwork fell through the cracks.
Now, what do you say? Okay, because I am gonna challenge this a little bit for our listeners who are thinking, all right, Karen, I have done that, and I get a snarky response because he's like, don't you think I can remember anything? Or you don't think I can do this? And, that makes it hard on the mom. And hey, sometimes it may not be delivered in that way, but often it's just really received with a lot of past stuff. And I do think, and this is me, like, if, especially, I don't know how the law is in Montana, but, here in Florida, it's just recently become more of a 50-50. And I think there are still a lot of families that do that shared. The men fight very hard to have half the time. And I think they got to figure it out too. And I'm not going to be, I'm not speaking for myself. I'm speaking like my point of view would be like, I can't, one, if I can get to the acceptance that I'm not in control of things that go on when they're not with me, because I fully understand that. But I also think they got to figure this out. They don't want my input because they receive it as me controlling everything they do. So they got to figure this out. They wanted this. They wanted 50% of the time. They need to learn how to parent and get this stuff together for the kids.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think as women, we almost train our husbands into incompetency. And during the marital time, I would venture to guess, because we arrive with the biology, we have the mammary glands, we have the uterus, that early bonding, as well as the social expectation that we will be the primary caretaker, that we end up being the primary caretaker, and we do take care of everything. And I remember kind of having my own complaint again, like, I'm always the one who remembers the diaper bag, and I'm always the one who has to keep track of, and I'm always the one. And my therapist saying, well, how about just don't pack the diaper bag before you leave the house, and don't put it in the car, and just turn to the father of your children and say, hey, would you make sure the diaper bag's put together and in the house? Yeah. Right? So I think there is a gap when we come out the other side of marriage to divorce, where women have done the primary work of the caregiving. And it's easier, like you said, for those dads to just kind of go along the way. Mm-hmm. So what do we do on the other side of divorce to help their success? Now, that doesn't mean it's my responsibility as the mother, and they're probably not open to micromanaging, but it can mean, what are the systems that we can put in place so that both parents can be successful? Because that's in the best interest of the children. And honestly, my clients, I always tell them, I'm working with you, but I work for your children. Your children are my clients. And it is my job to help you protect your relationship, to not do damage to each other, and help both of you be successful and stable for the sake of raising your children. So we might integrate something like, obviously, a shared calendar. Get yourself, whether it's on a parenting platform or a Google, a shared calendar that both of you are populating. So when you hear about the extra rehearsal, the game, the slumber party, the birthday that's happening, the present that needs to be bought, that it's there. And then it becomes each person's individual responsibility to be paying attention, right? That's where you're saying, like, dads, pay attention to what's on the calendar. Right. Then we might also do something like what I call the boomerang folder, where information's coming home from school, paperwork, maybe a spelling test, a project, that goes into a folder that goes back and forth between the homes. So there's something tangible, so that it doesn't just come home and it goes on mom's refrigerator and dad never sees it. Or we take a picture of it at that moment and we send it to the other parent. Like, hey, this just came home. There's going to be a field trip next week. It lands on your day, giving you a heads up. Here's the information. I'm done. Right. Yeah. Right? It's leaning into, again, this idea of how do we help each other be successful on behalf of our kids? And that's where, honestly, a divorce coach, a co-parenting specialist, that mediating, a lawyer's expertise is really about unraveling the assets and getting to that final settlement. But now we have to coexist as co-parents. And there is a growing movement of people like myself who really are pioneering in this field to help people after the fact. Again, you're divorced now. You got to co-parent together, and to get some of these tools in place so that you're not aggravated with each other. You don't feel like you're being micromanaged. You're not rolling your eyes every day because the other parent is not figuring it out. And if you want to be that devoted 50% parent, and I think kids in some cases get more of their fathers through divorce because it's a lot easier to be an absent dad when there's an ever-present mother. So now suddenly there is a schedule that says you got to show up 50% of the time. You're going to be doing the laundry. You're going to be doing the grocery shopping. You're going to be preparing the meals. You're going to be the Uber. And I celebrate that because what we know is that when kids have healthy relationships with both of their parents, they do better in the future. So sometimes we got to rise above the irritation to try and find the successful system that works for the kids.
Okay, I have two questions that came out of that. Hopefully, I'll be able to remember the second one after I ask the first one. But the first one is that you say someone's listening and they're like, oh, that would be amazing. And they want to work with you, but their spouse doesn't. It doesn't work, right? Unless it's both.
Well, I work with couples and I work with individuals.
Okay.
And when I'm working with individuals, it might look more like your world, Heather, where it's a one-sided journey where there might be an adversarial on the other side. And then my work becomes self-preservation, setting boundaries, reinventing self, maybe rebuilding self-esteem. As we talked about, we can feel a lot of shame and failure, and it can really erode our self-esteem coming through. Divorce might be working with them, also thinking about as you go back into dating, what are the patterns that you do not want to repeat? What were the blind spots of your marriage? And again, what can you do on your side of the street that maybe will help with the other side of the street? And we are not always going to get those compatible, cohesive relationships post-divorce. But I do believe there are more couples out there looking for an alternative journey who don't even know there's a middle pathway. So happy to work with individuals and couples.
Got
And
it.
your second question.
Well, I wanted to touch on spousal support because, I know you talked about that. That is a continued relationship. And how will this realization, help you understand if that's something you want or not?
Yeah. So, different states, as you know, provide spousal support. And there's some states where it's really hard to get spousal support. And, I had one family. So, and to clarify for listeners, there's spousal support and then there's also child support. And those are two different things. And Heather, you might actually take us down a quick educational moment. And certainly in the state of Florida, how that's determined and calculated and when spousal support, under what situations it might be awarded and in cases where it wouldn't be awarded.
Yes, and it's the ability to pay and the need. And then there's a formula, and then of course make it more complicated. It depends on how long you've been married. A lot of factors go into that. And I think for the majority of our listeners, if you've been married, if you think of the classic alimony / spousal support case, it's a long-term marriage where generally and stereotypically the wife stayed home, the husband worked, and now at the divorce, she's seeking that financial support.
Yes. And in cases where women have set aside their careers or even perhaps been oppressed by their spouse and they come out the other side of divorce and they, they might be middle-aged or older and ageism might be in the way. Maybe they didn't get to complete their education because they started mothering. And maybe their career was shut down. So for one reason or another, they are already way behind the starting gate and at a disadvantage. That is when spousal support just makes sense. And thank goodness we have it, because it is a way that we balance and equalize the experience of those, two parents, or potentially, maybe there's not children involved. But in our focus today, that suddenly we've got a situation where there is a huge gap in financial stability. So we need to close that gap. For those of you listening who have education, maybe have had a career, have been working, I always want to challenge, particularly my female clients, and when I'm working one-on-one, again, what is the story you're wanting to write about yourself? And how much attachment do you want to keep with this particular spouse? Which really comes about dependency. And if you felt trapped in the marriage, then I would say, let's pause and think about how much dependency you want with this person moving forward. What if, right? And it's always a what if you leaned into your career? What if you went back to school? What if you added another certification so that in your post-divorce journey, you became more and more independent, more self-sufficient, and more financially secure on your own without having to lean on your former spouse? I think anytime there's a tether between us over time, there is the possibility of rupture. It's kind of like a rubber band, right? We come in, we go out, we've got to deal with college, and now we've got a little break, and oh, now there's a wedding, and who's going to pay for what, right? It's this rubber band relationship. And the more, tethers we have between us, those rubber bands can snap and things can change. So I'm always a fan of as much independence as you can create within reason. Go for that. Become your own strong, right? I mean, you do this work also, Heather, in terms of successful entrepreneur. I've started a number of businesses. I've been self-employed for 18 years. And that means satisfying my need not only for my overhead, but also my retirement, my health insurance. And I was in a situation where, the calculation at the time of divorce was such that I was awarded a payment. And I really thought long and hard and decided I don't want to be in the conversation of money going back and forth between us and it being recalculated and the resentment and who's paying when. And frankly, I want to go on and become really successful. I don't want the tables to turn. I don't want to give you one more penny in my life. I want us both to be independent and to support our kids 50-50 financially. So we stepped out of the conversation of payments going to each other, a calculation, and made the commitment right out. We will both be employed. We will both take care of our households, and we will both invest in the needs of our kids 50-50. That's part of the design of divorce that some of us have the opportunity to do. And again, Heather, that is not everybody's story. Some people are coming out of oppressive, abusive, toxic relationships, and there absolutely should be a settlement and spousal support moving forward.
Yes, and child support, because that again is, even if you're sharing the time with the children when there's a huge disparity in incomes, it may be necessary. But again, that's a formula, and but I think it's important to look at, that creates a different relationship between you and your ex. And, but you shouldn't, my opinion is don't sacrifice that just because you think that he's going to be nicer. Because if you're already thinking that, then that's probably not true. I think that that is a unique, wonderful situation that you were in. And I think that, sometimes people have that. And I think more and more as women are, really successful in the workplace, they can come to the divorce negotiations on a level playing field. But, for those of you who don't, I don't think that is something you have to do in order to have a good relationship, co-parenting. But don't you think, I would like, to touch on a little bit about how do you think co-parenting in that relationship with your ex changes as your children grow? And let's start with, let's say, all right, you're divorcing and you've got a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old. Obviously your children are going to go through a lot in those next, 8 years. But how would you advise, some of our listeners, like what should they expect? How's that going to change a little bit on that co-parenting?
This is such a great question, Heather. And I think we underestimate the need for a flexible and progressive and dynamic, actually, parenting plan that models the needs of the kids. So we know when, under the age of 5, those are the strong attachment years. And we know in those early biological years, upon arrival, there is strong attachment with mother. And sometimes dads don't even quite know how to support. And doing long stretches that might be a week on, week off when your kids are really little might seem not only impossible for you emotionally, but isn't necessarily recommended for young kids. They need constant contact with both parents in order to develop those healthy attachments. Once we get into school age, right, and we're maybe ages 6 to 10, then we can start thinking about week on, week off. That's the standard. Or maybe it's a 2-2-5-5, right? Some of you might be, hearing these numbers and this is all new thinking. Well, there will be people in your journey who will help guide you again. But I think where I see parents get it wrong is they lock in a parenting plan, and then it is so rigid. Nothing can change, whether that's, grandma's coming to town and the kids are with their other parent, but we'd love to make an accommodation. And parents like doubling down, like, no, absolutely not. Like that. There's no parent plan police who come around to see if you've done this or that. The two of you as parents, just like when you were in one house, like, I've got a work trip. Let's make sure that, you're not going on your golf trip the same time that I have to go to this conference. And we negotiate and we make sure that the kids have coverage, that they have parents. So liberating for what makes sense. I would also say then as kids begin to age, like that 10 to 12, you said, that tween, by then they really want to start settling into one home. What we know is transitions are disruptive. So the more the kids are going back and forth, the more we know there's going to be a disruption. Everyone's house is different. We're moving belongings. There might be this kind of dynamic at this home. We eat differently. We've got different schedules. So we don't want our kids to feel like a ping pong in a shoebox. So getting more consistency. I have one family, their kids came to them, and I think it was really in the after effects of COVID when the kids were really hunkered down with their parents. And they were moving into middle school. And they said, can we actually just do 2 weeks at a time at a house? We are really tired of moving our stuff around. And as kids get older, they start to care more about, I need these jeans. I need that jewelry. I've got those shoes. I've got all my gear for basketball practice, right? Just logistically, it starts to get complicated. So we begin to think about, if we were to stretch that out, and I know someone's like, 2 weeks? How could I go 2 weeks and not see my kids? The reality is, if your kids are active and you're an engaged parent, you're going to see your kids regularly.
Yeah.
You might have a lunch with them during your off week. You might be running shuttle with the carpool. You're going to go to that basketball game. You're going to go to that choir concert. And if we can accommodate also what the children are asking for, then those longer stretches end up creating more stability for everyone. And I think the last age area that we really underestimate is significant and still requires active co-parent conversation is when graduation happens, high school graduation, 18. And many of us were like, we're done now. I don't have to deal with their parent anymore. We're out of all the legal stuff. Okay, I want each and every listener to think back to their own life between the ages of 18 and 25. We are figuring it out. We might be going off to college. We might be coming home. We might drop out of college and have to live there in the summer. We might, right? It's this boomerang. We're still typically financially dependent on our parents. We're probably still receiving insurance. We might still be using the car that we had in high school. And we might be needing financial support from both of our parents. And this is the age where my kids are now. They were 5 and 7, kindergarten and first grade when we divorced. We've lived 6 blocks apart this entire time, and we are now launching our kids. We have a senior at 18, and we have almost a 20-year-old into college. And we are still in conversation about tuition, about are we going to still help pay for car insurance? Where does Thanksgiving happen? And I particularly want to reach out, and I'm going to pause, Heather, because as you can see, the sun has come up in Montana.
I have, yes.
We're going to let all that be edited out. Thank you in advance, Olivia. I promise to give you a nice little edit.
There we go.
There we go. So one other part of kind of the kid evolution that I think gets forgotten about is that cliff at 18. And so for listeners who indeed have very intentionally said, I will just ask for the divorce after the kids have graduated. There is still a need. And what happens is that those young adults and your family, you have no past history. You have no guide rails in how to function as a family across 2 homes. And I have seen kids who go off to college and then their parents get divorced and they're like, do I have a bedroom somewhere? Where is all my stuff that's in storage? What happens for Christmas? Do I talk to both of them when I do need money? How do I now negotiate my parents' divided relationship because we have no routine? Kids whose parents divorce sometime in their school age years, we have built up a pattern and an understanding of how we function as a family that lives across 2 homes. So do not let your kids fall off the cliff. Know that they still need active parenting and that you and their co-parent are still going to have some conversations.
Absolutely. Well, and that is great advice, Karen. I can't believe we have reached the end of our show. But before we go, can you impart on our listeners what you've learned about women and their resilience throughout your career and experience?
Oh, ladies, I really want you to move into this next chapter of your life, not with shame and not with self-disappointment, but to recognize the wisdom of reinvention and that indeed the best is yet to come. And it is hard to see that and know that when we are in the despair of a marriage that is being dissolved. But hold on to the hope and know that reinvention and empowerment and maybe even new love is on the horizon for you.
Oh, thank you so much, Karen. Lastly, where can our listeners find you for more information and resources?
Well, the easiest path is just to Google The Good Divorce Coach or The Good Divorce Show, which is my partner podcast, where not only do I talk to experts, but I also bring families, kids, adult children, others who have had great divorce experiences, who have had a lot of successes. And it is wonderful to hear 2 parents sit down and talk about their journey so that we know what that looks and sounds like. So again, KarenMcNenny.com or thegooddivorcecoach.com.
Well, thank you so much. We've reached the end of our show today. And of course, thank you to Karen McNenny for joining us to discuss how your relationship changes, but it isn't over after divorce. And listeners, if you or someone you know is going through divorce or is thinking about a divorce in the Northeast Florida area, please reach out to us at FloridaWomen'sLawGroup.com. You'll find our practice areas and the link to our site in the show notes, as well as Karen's links. Thank you for listening.